Once upon a time, there was a small indie dev studio with big dreams of making a hit game. The vision of these devs was simple. They would take some ideas from popular monster collecting games and put their own spin on it. Different characters, different gameplay, a totally different story, but with some familiar, albeit mixed up mechanics and some multiplayer magic. The potential success of their game attracted a powerful industry sponsor who utilized a subsidiary to help them develop their franchise, and together, the three entities joined forces and set up a fourth independent company to manage the intellectual property, with a bit of quid pro quo baked in. Power over the IP is increasingly funneled towards the large industry sponsor in exchange for protection and access to said sponsor's resources for the indie dev. A win-win, perhaps. Let me ask you, dear viewer, what game am I talking about here? Is it Pokémon, or is it Palworld? If we haven't met before, hi, I'm Mooney and I'm a lawyer, and I've made a bunch of different videos on Pokémon and Nintendo and intellectual property law. And this video, this Nintendo vs. Palworld lawsuit video, is the culmination of everything I've previously discussed with you. This is everything we've talked about, the worst case scenario come to pass, and the different articles I've read on this topic around the internet simply do not have the combined cultural, business, and legal understanding to truly make heads or tails of it all. This lawsuit between Nintendo and Pocket Pair, between Pokémon and Palworld, is much, much more complicated than Nintendo choosing to smash an annoying copycat rival. This lawsuit is enormously complex, with many moving parts. It requires an understanding of Japanese business practices, of Japanese IP law, of American IP law, of the differences between the two, of the threat that Palworld actually represents in both of those bodies of law, and of the strained relationship between Nintendo and an old rival. And through this understanding, we shall discover that the true enemy Nintendo is concerned with here is not the hapless indie devs at Pocket Pair. That it's not about crushing an upstart rival or even necessarily protecting a valuable patent, though these are certainly aggravating factors. Indeed, there is a much greater and more desperate foe. In my very first true video, the video on why Nintendo is so overprotective of its IP, I made the case that big business is ranked competitive capitalism. And in that dark, dangerous jungle, predators are always circling, waiting to take a bite out of you when you are vulnerable. This lawsuit, Nintendo vs. Palworld, this is potentially the first match in an S-tier tournament grand final. This is a predator sensing weakness and taking a bite, but you might be surprised by who the predator is and who the prey is. For you see, the grand prize of this legal tournament isn't Palworld. Palworld is merely the battlefield. No, the true reward, the juicy potential prey, the grand prize at stake is not Palworld. It's Pokémon. This is going to be a long video about law and business, so you might want to grab a snack. And if the snack you're hankering for is Japanese, or if you're one of the many Moon Channel viewers who loves learning about Japan, why not take a look at this video's sponsor, Zen Market. Let's pretend for a moment that you're a giant weeb who desperately wants to get a figurine of your favorite talking, singing robot pigtail girl, but alas, this merchandise is available only in Japan, with shipping only to Japanese addresses. Or let's say you're a Japanese person abroad who wishes that they could get access to certain books or amenities or even foods that just aren't available outside of Japan. How do you buy Japanese without a shipping address or without the language skills? Well, that's where Zen Market comes in. Zen Market is a proxy shopping service. What that means is Zen Market allows you to buy and ship goods directly from Japanese websites without the need to know Japanese or have a Japanese address. With over 10,000 Japanese stores ranging from Rakuten to Amazon Japan to Yahoo Auctions and more, if you want Japanese stuff, Zen Market is up to snuff. Your items from all over Japan will come to you in a single box without consolidation fees and with 60 days of free storage so that you can shop around while keeping your shipping costs to a minimum. Here's how it works. You browse the various marketplaces and add stuff to your cart. Zen Market confirms the prices and their availability, and then you pay Zen Market for your stuff. Zen Market then buys the stuff for you from the shops you selected. Once the items arrive at Zen Market's warehouse, you specify your shipping details, pay for shipping, and in a week or so, you will get your package fresh from Japan. And here's something, if you sign up with my link and use promo code MOONCHANNEL, you'll get 1,000 Zen points as a sign-up bonus. That's 1,000 yen off international shipping. Zen Market is trusted by over 2 million users and has functionality in 19 different languages, including Portuguese for all of my beloved Brazilians. So get shopping and get shipping, get that exclusive Poke plushie or Miku figurine and embrace your innermost weeb. Or be like me and get a Creative Boss Black for your office. With Zen Market. That's Zen Market with promo code MOONCHANNEL. A special thanks to Zen Market for sponsoring this video. There comes a time in every lawyer's career, I think, when the question arises, what is more important to you, money or morality? I know, very ironic question, Mooney. But look, you know what I mean, right? Some lawyers justify taking advantage of the system a little bit by being flexible with their morals, pretending not to see their immorality. Others take out a sort of moral IOU and tell themselves that they'll make up for their greedy behavior through philanthropy someday. But there are some lawyers who simply throw morality to the wind and go all in on the money, who become obsessed with being a big shot. You know the sort, I'm sure. The truth of the matter is that extraordinary riches and good morals seldom intersect. As I sometimes have had to tell my more fiscally enabled clients, nobody becomes a billionaire without making billionaire decisions. I'm not talking about the doctor at the ER here, I'm talking about Dr. Oz. Do you get what I'm saying? You can't make an omelet without cracking a few eggs, and let me tell you something. Every billionaire, no matter how good their PR department might be, has cracked a hell of a lot of eggs. Big business is the battleground in which the world billionaires fight, playing the least moral and most cutthroat competitive game of all time. The company that smiles to your face with its cool mascot and funny social media person is seeking to maximize profit from you, and likewise, is always on the lookout for ways to steal you and your money away from their competition. And if they don't play that game, well, somebody else will, and the moral company gets beaten in the great competition. Imagine a game of StarCraft or Age of Empires 2, right? There's pools of resources, and you have to outwit and outmaneuver your opponent to take control of those resources, with the ultimate goal of crushing said opponent. The victory then goes to the person or team who in the end is uncontested. Now imagine the same game but in tournament settings. There's rules set by a governing body about what you can and cannot do in the course of play. And while some of your decisions might not be moral, might be a bit dirty, like using a maneuvering glitch in the grand finals of an S-tier tournament, if the rules allow it, then it's legal, and at the highest level of play, one takes every advantage that one can get. And the other players at that level also know the score. If you substitute the tournament rules with laws and the players with corporations, you start to get a sense of what big business is actually like. Idealistically, corporations should compete with each other by offering better products, cheaper prices, the idealized free market. In practice, in reality, a lot of the fighting in the corporate world occurs below the belt. And the realm of intellectual property law is one such a battlefield. It's like failing to protect your mineral line in StarCraft and having your enemy reaver drop your probes. Not every hit you take comes from the front. There's no 10 minutes no rush in big business ranked games, and failing to play the intellectual property game can mean losing your most valuable resources, your intellectual properties, and their rights, in the blink of an eye. To be clear, I don't mean that the intellectual property, the franchise, or the bundle of rights or what have you gets stolen here, though that is something that can happen. IP plays are Reavers, but not Dark Archons. They are Light Cav and not monks. If you're an AoE 2 nerd, they're more like Keshiks, actually. They destroy, but they don't necessarily steal. The point is that you want to attack your opponent's eco-advantage such that you can then get ahead of them militarily and thus territorially. Yes, seizure of resources is often involved, but just as often, the point is to damage the enemy's collection of resources as well, to put you further ahead in eco-advantage. The more eco-advantage you have, the more it snowballs. Translated into IP law then, oftentimes IP fights between large corporations aren't about seizing properties, they're about destabilizing an existing economy. And when we talk about destabilizing intellectual property, what we usually mean in the video games context is damaging a rival's trademarks. Now, the term intellectual property is a bit of a misnomer. It gives the wrong impression. IP is less a single tangible thing and much more of a bundle of divisible rights. And of these divisible rights, the big three are patents, copyright, and trademarks. I've discussed copyright and trademarks at length in the past. To summarize, though, a copyright is the exclusive legal right to produce and distribute something that one has made, and a trademark is a design used to distinguish the goods of one entity from those of another, to indicate the source of those goods. Which is to say, copyright gives you the exclusive right to sell something you made, and the trademark is the symbol that makes the thing you made different from the things other people make. This is Kirby and the Forgotten Land. Nintendo gets to sell copies of this game because it owns the copyright. This game is distinguished from other platformers because of its trademarks, because of Kirby. But here's a question, what about the patents? The box tells you who owns the copyright and who owns the trademarks. Patents, though, are tricky. The box doesn't tell you what is or isn't patented. The game cartridge is patented, probably, but is the box design? Are there certain mechanics of Kirby that are patented that other games cannot use by merit of its patents? None of that is readily apparent, and indeed, as we will see, patent law is quite a bit trickier than copyright and trademark law, in part due to its opacity. Getting back to Palworld and Nintendo, you may have noticed that the opacity surrounding patent law has led to a lot of conjecture over the nature of Nintendo's lawsuit. Not even Pocket Pair, the defendant, knows which Nintendo patents they're allegedly infringing. There are pundits hunting through Nintendo's patents looking for the potential exact patents at play. Is Pocket Pair infringing upon Nintendo's 3D person-catching mechanic patent? Is it infringing upon a Pokémon storage patent? Wasn't there a similar lawsuit involving Nintendo just a few years ago? All of that is, in my opinion, a bit of a red herring. There are innumerous patent lawsuits in the video game space, many of which you've simply never heard about. And Nintendo has always had the power to sue any number of different devs over its patents. They simply choose not to. Palworld, in that way, is special somehow. You may have already heard about Nintendo's lawsuit against Japanese mobile game company Capitalism back in 2017 over patents involving touchscreen joystick controls and character attacks based on touch inputs. That ended up with Capitalism having to fork over around $21 million and ongoing licensing fees. In this Games Radar article on the subject, analyst Sirkin Toto states that Nintendo could have sued half of the gaming industry back in 2017 over its patents. Capitalism was special. And that might have something to do with Dragalia Lost, but we're not going to get into it in this video. You may not have heard, though, for example, of Anescape Limited versus Nintendo of America Incorporated, a 2006 case in which American company Anescape sued both Microsoft and Nintendo alleging a violation of their controller patents. Microsoft settled, but Nintendo chose to fight it out. Nintendo initially lost and was required to both stop using the technology, which at the time meant no more Wiimotes, GameCube controllers, or Wavebirds, and to pay, $21 million in damages. By sheer coincidence, the same number as the Capitalism damages. But Nintendo appealed this case to the United States Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, where they succeeded in reversing the decision of the lower court on April 13, 2010. Anescape was hardly the only party that saw an opportunity. During the Wii/Wii U era, Nintendo was also sued by Philips, the toothbrush people, Triton Tech, Creative Kingdoms, Think Optics, Recognicorp, iLife Technologies, Motion Games, Game Vice, and Tomita, amongst others. All of these patent suits, except for the Recognicorp suit, were related to controller designs. The Recognicorp suit was for facial recognition related to Miis. Almost all of these suits were won by Nintendo, and the ones which were not were either settled or dropped. Let's zoom in for a moment on one of the cases mentioned. In Nintendo v. Tomita, it was Nintendo on the back foot. Tomita had accused Nintendo of infringing upon its patents with the 3DS in a different suit, Tomita Technologies v. Nintendo, and Nintendo filed its own lawsuit against Tomita to invalidate Tomita's patents in response. Nintendo failed to invalidate the patents, but it did eventually succeed against Tomita, but only after a very lengthy process. Tomita filed suit in 2011 and was awarded $30.2 million in damages in 2013 by a federal jury. Nintendo then appealed the decision, and to make a long story short, the Federal Circuit Court held in 2017 that Nintendo did not infringe upon Tomita's patents. From beginning to end, the suit took more than 6 years to resolve. There have been tons of patent suits filed against Nintendo, but despite how many patents Nintendo holds, and thus the massive amount of leverage Nintendo has in the industry, Nintendo has not filed very many of its own patent suits. Nintendo is hesitant to wield patents as a weapon even against emulation, where one imagines that use would make the most sense. There's pretty much only Nintendo v. Colipol to point to when it comes to patent suits in recent memory. In consideration then of what we've discussed so far, I want you to look between the lines. Do you notice something here about all of these lawsuits? Is there something missing? Well, what's missing is patent suits between big players. Nintendo was willing to bring the fight to Colipol, a medium-sized player that, at the time, had the potential to make it to the big leagues. But they could have also just as easily bought the fight to Microsoft or to Sony or to any number of mobile game companies. The world of patent law is a minefield with nuclear mines. This is not like copyright or trademarks. You can't readily see where the mines are buried. And depending on the entity you're taking on, the minefield can be extremely vast and perilous, with very explosive mines. Thus, there is something of a status quo amongst large companies concerning patents, most of the time, at least. If a move does need to be made, though, it's frequently like a charge out of a trench. It's an all-in, and the consequences can be devastating. Consider Apple versus Samsung, a series of no less than 50 multinational lawsuits with billions of dollars in damages at stake that started in early 2011 and was settled out of court 7 years later in 2018. When big players fight on the patent battlefield, the business world quakes. Why am I telling you all of this? Well, I want you to take away a few points here about the patent law arena. Number 1. Nintendo has a lot of patents and has, at times, chosen to enforce their patent rights over alleged infringers. Number 2. Nintendo has also been sued for alleged patent infringement many times before. Number 3. Most of these suits in both directions are relatively small potatoes because... Number 4. Patent lawsuits suck. They take forever, they are extremely complicated, and they're quite risky. You could easily take damage to your patents or lose them in the process of litigation. And thus, a large corporation with more to lose at stake will generally prefer not to engage in patent litigation against another big entity if they can avoid it. This results in a Cold War-esque mutually assured destruction status quo. A major corporation would only go over the top and charge the trenches that appear if they think that there is something massive to gain or lose, or if they are desperate enough that this is the play they think they need to make in a given instance. These points then beg the question, if patent litigation sucks so much, and Nintendo has so many potential candidates it could sue, why is it singling out Pocket Pair and Palworld? Why hammer this poor indie dev? Is it because they're small and Nintendo sees something to gain here? No. In fact, I'm going to posit that quite the opposite is true. That for those who follow the law, the business, and the background altogether, Nintendo did not cast the first stone here. This patent lawsuit is a desperate response to the desperate attack of a rival. We're getting there, but we need to broaden our scope a little bit first. I've given you a bit of background, but before we lift the veil, we need to broaden our scope a little bit. So far, I've discussed patents largely within the US context, but to properly understand what is going on, we need to discuss IP law within the international context, and the specifically Japanese context, before then putting aside the legal portion of the equation to solve the business side. With that in mind, let us now briefly discuss American IP law, Japanese IP law, and how IP holders have to maneuver differently in these different jurisdictions. When Palworld came out with its deep resemblance and apparent stylistic borrowing from Pokémon, many people feared a copyright suit was inbound. The two so closely resemble each other that there must be some copyright violation in there somewhere, right? But I, at the time, did not think that this was likely, not in the United States nor in Japan. I stated earlier that when it comes to the realm of video games, trademarks generally are the thing to protect. And typically, when copyright suits are filed in the United States, those suits are used as a bludgeon to protect the trademark. The trademark is the precious but brittle diamond that can be eroded by non-permissive use. As such, fighting on the copyright battlefield by proxy instead of fighting directly in the riskier trademark realm is a much preferred way of protecting the diamond. The immense success of Palworld certainly startled Nintendo. When Palworld released in January, Nintendo published a statement noting that they have not granted any permission for the use of Pokémon intellectual property or assets in that game, referring presumably to Palworld. They also noted that they would investigate and take appropriate measures to address any acts that infringe on intellectual property rights related to Pokémon. But I do not suspect that Nintendo actually intended to do anything at the time. Palworld was certainly a smash hit, but Pocket Pair was just some small indie dev. That aside, Palworld is a clear parody, an exaggerated, sometimes comedic imitation of another creative work. It takes the cognitive dissonance of Pokémon, the fighting and ownership mechanics that contrast with Pokémon's themes of friendship, and dials that up to 11. With pals that shoot each other to apparent death with firearms, the ability to butcher pals and enslave actual other people with pseudo-Pokeballs and more. It's a pretty brutal and horrifying world, but packaged in that cute, familiar Pokémon vibe, which is what makes it funny and commentary, and thus parody and art. And parody in the United States is a protected form of free expression as per the First Amendment and is also transformative fair use. But parody protection is much more complicated than it seems, as American law makes a distinction between parody and satire. In Campbell v. Acuff Rose Music Incorporated, the Supreme Court states that parody needs to mimic an original to make its point, and so has some claim to use the creation of its victims, or collective victims, imagination, whereas satire can stand on its own 2 feet, and so requires justification for the very act of borrowing. Which is to say, these Silva Gunner and Timmy Turner's Granddad rips I'm using as background music are parody, and not satire, because the commentary, the joke, cannot exist without the quote-unquote victim. Palworld is clearly borrowing rather heavily from Pokémon, but it's not really hiding it, and the use is arguably necessary for the art. Thus, parody and not mere satire. I think any IP lawyer would be hard-pressed to argue otherwise, quite frankly. And thus, trying to take the fight to Palworld, if that's what Nintendo wants to do to protect its trademark in the realm of copyright, is a no-go, at least in the United States. But what about Japan? Aren't things very different there? Well, yes. Although much of international IP law has been standardized, interpretations of the standards therein are left to each signatory to figure out. In the United States, for example, we have fair use doctrine, which allows an affirmative defense to be applied to potential acts of copyright infringement. A court weighs the purpose and character of the use, the nature of the copyrighted work, the amount and substantiality of the original work used, and the effect of the new work on the potential market. If the purpose of the use is parody, well, that weighs in favor of the use as fair use. Japan does not have fair use. As a civil law state, what Japan does have is a series of codified exceptions to certain uses of copyrighted works, which include incidental reproduction, like accidentally showing a copyrighted work in the background of a TV show, reproduction of a work for a museum, library, or research purpose, use in quotations, reproduction for educational purposes, reproduction for public speeches, and use by governmental agencies. These so-called fair dealings provisions are narrow. They have very limited wiggle room and thus little room for interpretation. Much of Japanese IP law is this way. It's narrowly written, and so everyone knows where the fences are. In contrast with American IP law, nobody knows where the fences are until you wander into one and discover that it's hooked up to a car battery. The result of this clarity in Japan means that there is much less of a need in Japan to file lawsuits to protect oneself or one's intellectual property. There's something of a status quo that can emerge. In truth, low-level intellectual property infringement is utterly rife in Japan. It's just the powerful IP holders have less fear that they could lose control over their IP due to the strictness of the system, and thus have limited incentive to go after these lesser infringing behaviors, whereas in the US, you're incentivized to be more aggressive as the value of your property increases. I've gone over that topic a few times in the past, but to make a very long story short, the vagueness and poor organization of the American IP law landscape, the dated nature of the DMCA and obstinacy of Congress has made it so that IP holders have to be constantly vigilant and protective, or else risk potentially losing valuable property. This is generally not the case in Japan. Consider, for example, Japanese doujin culture. When I mentioned doujinshi in a prior video, I was surprised to see a few snickers in the comments, as apparently there is a fundamental misunderstanding of what a doujin is. And I haven't spent enough time on the internet to learn this apparently by osmosis. Contrary to Western perceptions, doujinshi are not purely prurient works. Indeed, a doujinshi when translated is merely a self-published work, and the vast majority of self-published works aren't anything lewd. We're talking about self-published magazines, parodies of manga or games, and more. It's like AO3 or DeviantArt, right? It's self-published. You know, Game Freak was once a doujin, a self-published gaming fan magazine. But by definition, very many of these self-published doujins, these fan magazines or fan fictions or fan games, are copyright infringement. Few to none of these works qualify under Japan's clearly delineated fair dealings exceptions, and unlike the United States, there's little wiggle room here to argue, but also little to fear from the small fries as a result. Thus, Japanese companies are free to turn a blind eye towards minor infringement, knowing that these minor infringements won't add up to hurt them. And this unspoken agreement is understood in part by the Japanese fans of various franchises who protect this unspoken agreement, and thus their carte blanche permission to make and enjoy fan works by self-policing and pulling down blades of grass who climb too high. Thus, an interesting dynamic emerges when a fan game takedown happens that affects both the Japanese and Western communities of an IP. The Japanese community will tend to rally around the IP holder, presuming that the fan game creator broke the social contract that they're accustomed to. The social contract which protects all of their rights to enjoy fan games and make fan content. And the Western community will rally around the fan game, presuming that the IP holder is taking unnecessarily harsh action in violation of ostensible fair use allowances. And the audience around Palworld has been no different in this case. Japanese social media users are as vocally against Palworld and Pocket Pair as Western social media users are for Palworld and Pocket Pair. But there is a place where Japanese law and American law meet. In both of these situations, for different reasons, Nintendo has no recourse against Palworld via copyright infringement. In America, Palworld is likely a protected parody. In Japan, with its stricter rules for what copyright infringement entails, Palworld hasn't likely arisen to the level of infringement. As such, if Nintendo felt it necessary to act against Palworld to protect its trademarks, the remaining option is patents. Again, if the trademark is very valuable, you want to protect it however you can, and you want to do so by proxy if that is at all possible. To summarize then, patent lawsuits are complicated, and you generally want to avoid them, especially if large players are involved. When large players get involved, patent plays are a scary all-in with devastating potential consequences. That said, if you have an especially valuable trademark and less valuable patents, then you'd use every possible tool at your disposal to protect the trademark, even if it means putting those patents on the line. In the case of Palworld, the traditional bludgeon of copyright isn't available in both American and Japanese jurisprudence, but the patent bludgeon remains. And in this case, Nintendo has chosen to charge the field. The question that remains now is why? And this, I think, is something that most internet analysts simply don't understand. There are two scenarios, one of which we've already lightly touched upon, and which is the prevailing theory I've seen around the internet. The first scenario is that Nintendo saw Pocket Pair in the same way that it saw Callable, a rising power, a growing shrub in need of trimming before it got too powerful. Why let this potential rival grow beyond its boundaries to challenge you later when you have a perfectly good opportunity to strangle it now? But that generally isn't how Nintendo operates. I posit that there is a second and more likely scenario that everyone is overlooking. That this lawsuit is not Nintendo trying to shut down a small indie competitor with potential, but that it is a defensive action against the desperate offensive move of an old rival, which has set its eyes directly on Nintendo's trademark dominance. That this isn't about Pokémon versus Palworld, and is instead Nintendo versus Sony. If you're going to prison, one of the bits of conventional wisdom you might receive is don't accept any favors. Because favors, you see, come with strings attached, and if you accept food or amenities or worse, protection from someone stronger than you, you are under their thumb. In prison, nothing is truly free. There is an expectation of reciprocity that exists, and failure to adhere to this binding but unwritten agreement of reciprocity can have painful consequences. Big business is like prison in this way, but Japanese business is especially built around these unspoken, unwritten understandings. And violating the conditions of this unstated reciprocity can turn old partners into enemies for life in the drop of a hat. Everyone who has even a marginal knowledge of video game history knows the story of how Nintendo, quote-unquote, betrayed Sony. But this narrative of betrayal fails to capture the wider context of Nintendo's decision. The story that everyone knows goes something like this. In 1991, at the Consumer Electronics Show, Japanese tech giant Sony reveals that it is working with growing video game powerhouse Nintendo to create a version of the Super Nintendo that uses a CD drive. A new console known as the Nintendo PlayStation. To the untrained eye, this was awesome news for Nintendo. The addition of Sony's tech prowess to Nintendo's video game expertise would surely be an unstoppable 1-2 punch. The future of video gaming belonged to Nintendo. But remember, in Japanese business there is no free lunch. If you accept the favor of a larger company, there is a very real chance that the price you pay is your sovereignty. That's how Japanese business works. Larger Japanese corporations exist as conglomerates, gigantic webs of many subsidiaries, some of which may be directly or partially owned, but many of which are merely tied to the parent company in an indirect manner, sometimes by a bond as apparently flimsy as mere trust. And Nintendo, being amateurs at the time, realized Sony's intentions too late. Sony was not planning to be an equal partner. This was a sovereignty play, and Sony saw the opportunity to use Nintendo to conquer the video game market for itself. Nintendo decided then to flip the script. What happens next is often painted as Nintendo trying to shake Sony out of the video games industry, but I don't think that's true. It's almost certainly the case that Nintendo was merely trying to shake Sony out of Nintendo. The rest of the consequences be damned. The very next day, Nintendo announces a partnership with Philips. You remember Philips, right? The toothbrush people. The ones that sued Nintendo over the Wii? Nintendo once partnered with them too, but that's its own story for another day.
You've killed me!
Good.
Sony wasn't happy about that decision, naturally. With Nintendo narrowly escaping its clutches and having violated what Sony felt was a locked-in reciprocity agreement, Sony proceeded with its plans to enter the video game market on its own, resulting in the PlayStation. And for a time, Sony was quite successful. The PlayStation was a smash hit, and the PS2, well, it remains the best-selling video game console of all time. If you're curious about the top 10, number 2 is the DS, number 3 is the Switch. The Game Boy in color are number 4, the PS4 is number 5, the original PlayStation is number 6, the Wii is number 7, and the PS3 is number 8. Number 9 is the Xbox 360, and the GBA is number 10. Which begs the question then, where's the PS5? Well, the PS5 is down at number 14. To be fair, the PS5 still has a few years of life left in it, but unless Sony can come up with a meaningful reason to own the PS5, there isn't much incentive to buy one. Now is there? And that brings us to a critical part of this analysis. When Sony entered into the video games business without Nintendo, it quickly dominated the industry. But Nintendo's slow and steady growth strategy has outpaced Sony's almost American preference for short-term gains, perhaps not in share price, but certainly in industry dominance. Sure, Nintendo still struggles on the technology side with weaker hardware and backwards online functionality, but the big N makes up for that with innovation, and more importantly perhaps, with valuable and cultivated franchises. Valuable trademarks. Nintendo has Mario, Zelda, Donkey Kong, Kirby, Pokémon, Animal Crossing, Splatoon, Fire Emblem, Metroid, Pikmin, Star Fox, and Advance Wars, and F-Zero, and Style Savvy, and Yoshi, and Xenoblade, and Nintendogs. And what does Sony have? It has once great franchises like The Last of Us, or Horizon, or God of War that they're failing to cultivate and instead milking dry with that short-term gains mentality. They have a bunch of derivative annual sports games they sell to junkies produced with the same careful attention to detail that psychiatrists in LA use to write prescriptions for Ozempic. They have franchises like Ratchet & Clank or Jak and Daxter, neither of which have ever managed to escape the sensibilities and humor of the early 2000s. They have Ridge Racer.
Ridge Racer! Remember that one?
And they have knack. Sony keeps slamming their heads into the brick wall of the completely saturated live service space, keen on indulging as much as possible in their last mover disadvantage, with some of the most creative and brilliant devs in the industry being wasted on dead at inception, boardroom designed and utterly visionless games. They've tried and failed to gain traction in the VR market, in cloud gaming, and TV live streaming, and more. They're in the midst of a slump and cutting staff even as Nintendo increases salaries. They're in the situation that Microsoft pretends they're in. They're where Ubisoft was 3 years ago. Their short-term business focus is hurting even their long-term partners, with the success of the Final Fantasy remakes getting bottlenecked by PlayStation exclusivity, for example. On Game Rant's PlayStation franchise tier list, MLB The Show is placed in the quote-unquote cute and creative B tier. What I'm saying is, everything has gone downhill for Sony in the video game space since E3 2006.
The stages of the game will also be based on famous battles which actually took place in ancient Japan. For example, so here's this giant enemy crab, and you attack its weak point for massive damage.
Which brings us now finally to the point. Sony badly needs a win, and Sony's leadership is willing to cross a few lines to get that win. We saw them cross the line already when they took the fight to Microsoft over the Activision merger. Well, now it's Nintendo's turn. Remember that a win isn't just about seizing territory. It's not just about securing that gold pile or those minerals. It's also about denying your enemy access to resources, just as much as it is about securing your own. Along then comes Palworld, developed by Pocket Pair. About as hapless a studio of indie devs as there ever could be. Good, simple folks with big dreams and great ideas, and unfortunately, some large $ eyes. The game blows up in an extraordinary fashion, much to the utter shock of Pocket Pair. And in this moment, Sony sees an opportunity to score a major victory against an old rival who was supposed to belong to them. The story of Pokémon and Palworld are eerily similar. And no, I don't mean the actual in-game story, I mean more specifically the story of Game Freak and Pocket Pair. I alluded to this in the intro of the video, but understanding Nintendo's concerns here requires one to observe the emergence of Palworld through their lenses. Game Freak, the company behind Pokémon, was founded by one Satoshi Tajiri. It was as indie a company as it gets. Tajiri was just a single guy working on a doujin video game fan magazine. When the magazine, Game Freak, got popular, he was able to hire some staff, and when video games started getting boring, Tajiri sought to make his own game. To that end, he approached Nintendo for help, and Nintendo, seeing the potential, took Game Freak under its wing. But remember, there's no free lunch in Japanese business. Nintendo's bargain was this: we keep you financially afloat, we assist you with publishing and promoting and assets, but control over the franchise you've made, over Pokémon, well, that belongs to us too. You can learn more about those dynamics in the last video I made on who really owns Pokémon. It's a lot more complicated than you might think. But how about Palworld dev Pocket Pair? Well, Pocket Pair was also an independent doujin company. They had troubles with financing and backers, but eventually produced their first game, the roguelike card battler Overdungeon, which opened the door to their second game, the fun but underbaked open-world survival game Craftopia. These were modest successes that built a framework, not unlike Game Freak's early releases in Mendel Palace or Pulseman. When making Palworld, Pocket Pair relied on a random 20-year-old convenience store part-timer with zero experience in game development that they found on Twitter, because this person had uploaded some gun-reloading fan animations related to the lascivious mobile gacha game Girls Front Line, somewhat paralleling the onboarding of Game Freak artist and director Ken Sugimori, the guy who designed most of the original 151 Pokémon. He joined up with Game Freak to work on art after discovering the Game Freak magazine at a doujin shop. Pokémon, as you know, is not owned by Game Freak, at least not exclusively. Nintendo created a company called Creatures Inc. to help Game Freak with assets and marketing and merchandising. And Creatures, Game Freak, and Nintendo joined together to create the Pokémon Company, of which they all own a 1/3 share, but which in reality is largely controlled by Nintendo's interests. How is this similar to Palworld? Well, on July 10, 2024, Sony Music Entertainment, its group subsidiary Aniplex, and Pocket Pair established their own joint venture, Palworld Entertainment Incorporated. Why Sony Music Entertainment and not Sony Interactive Entertainment with the rest of the video game stuff? Well, for one, Sony Interactive is not a favored child right now of the higher-ups at Sony, and it doesn't have a good track record with valuable franchises. But also, Sony Music Entertainment is no stranger to the video games industry itself. Sony Music once had its own independent game publishing label called Unties, which functioned a lot like Ape Incorporated over at Nintendo, supporting promising indie projects. And who is Aniplex? Well, Aniplex is almost exactly like early Creatures, but much larger in scope and scale. Aniplex publishes video games and manages copyright, merchandising, and licensing. Oh, and it also produces a lot of anime, including but not limited to Full Metal Alchemist, Madoka Magica, Fate, Sword Art Online, and Demon Slayer. Oh, also it co-owns Crunchyroll. The other co-owner is Sony Pictures. And Sony Music, Sony Interactive, Aniplex, and Sony Pictures are all Sony. That's Japanese business for you. What this means, though, is that Pocket Pair has signed a Devil's Pact. Pocket Pair's decision to seek the support of Sony ties them to Sony, and if Palworld grows, Sony's control over both the franchise and Pocket Pair will inevitably solidify. So in a quite literal sense, Palworld is to Sony as Nintendo is to Pokémon, and that is potentially extremely dangerous to Nintendo. Pocket Pair by itself is not worth throwing the patent lawsuit at, especially not in Japan if it's just some indie dev, even if Palworld is a massive hit. But Sony making a move on you is an entirely different animal. Sony is capable of doing massive damage and following through with it. Pocket Pair has handed Sony an extremely popular Pokémon-like that uses Pokémon's in-game mechanics that parodies and highlights the cognitive dissonance in Pokémon games that Nintendo would prefer you not think about. With exclusive merchandise already released and far bigger things on the horizon. More games, perhaps. Expansions, mobile games, sure. But also maybe an anime, a manga, a TCG, and more. The Chillet plush you buy is the Pikachu plush you don't buy. In normal business conditions, Sony might steer clear of such an aggressive action against Nintendo's interests. This is a clearly aggressive move at the crown jewel of another player. But Sony is desperate, Sony is a cornered beast, and this is a golden opportunity to take a nasty bite out of the most valuable media franchise in the history of the world. Palworld recently came out on PS5 in every country but Japan, much to the surprise of many a casual observer. But it's no surprise if you can read between the lines and see what's going on here. Returning then to our talk on IP law, Nintendo can't respond to this threat to its brand, to its trademarks, with the normal copyright sledgehammer. By complete accident, Pocket Pair has stumbled into a happy little niche in the law both in Japan and the United States, as we already discussed. The only safe avenue is a patent suit, and Nintendo has an incredible number of patents at its disposal. Thus, it uses patents here to launch its counter-salvo with the intention, of course, of avoiding any trademark action which could put its valuable core directly in harm's way. Patent actions, as we stated, suck. They take forever, they are expensive, and there can be a lot at stake sometimes. But no matter how much this patent lawsuit hurts, it cannot hurt more than direct damage to the unspeakably valuable Pokémon brand. This is why I've stated that it almost doesn't matter what patents Pocket Pair is infringing upon. We'll discuss what the patents could be in the following aggravating factors section, but the patents themselves are less important than the motives, in my opinion. Because once you understand what's actually going on in the background, Nintendo's behaviors suddenly seem a lot less hostile and predatory. It is Sony on the prowl, and Nintendo responding to this action with an overwhelming show of force, hoping that a victory here can cause Sony to think twice, or at the very least, riposte Sony's initial thrust. We've covered my main theory now on the Pokémon v Palworld lawsuit, but there are admittedly some aggravating factors, and I think it's important to consider that there are matters outside of Sony and trademarks that we should also discuss. I do not believe that these are primary considerations for the suit, merely secondary considerations. The first of these considerations is that Takuro Mizobe, the CEO of Pocket Pair and director of Palworld, worked at Nintendo for a short time. Stephen Totillo at Gamefile.news interviewed Mizobe, who stated that when he, Mizobe, was still a college student, he participated in a one-year Nintendo Games seminar, a training program for aspiring creators. Mizobe showed off the game he made to Totillo. It's called Tentaisho, and it was released as a free downloadable game available via DS Download Play. The game released on April 27, 2011. When asked if he had learned any lessons from working with Nintendo that stuck to him, Mizobe responded with a laugh. "Kind of," he said. "I always think to make new things is very hard. In game development, of course, sometimes we have to do it, but as much as possible, I try to avoid creating new things." Well, he's an honest guy, I'll give him that. Also in the course of this interview, Mizobe asks Totillo, while showing off Tentaisho, to notice that the game used both of the DS screens for gameplay, a contrast with how most DS games treated one screen as its main gameplay view and used the other for support functions. So Mizobe worked at Nintendo, that's a shocker. Maybe he took some ideas with him, right? Is that what you were getting at, Mooney? Well, no, it's more than that, for you see, Mizobe did more than just make a freeware game for the DS. Takuro Mizobe is listed as an inventor on a Nintendo patent, a patent that pertains to the use of both DS screens, the very feature that he showed off to Totillo. Patent number 8491383, filed May 12, 2011, just a few weeks after Tentaisho released on the DS. Is it possible then that Mizobe used some inside knowledge that he shouldn't have had to come up with these systems in Palworld? Objection, Your Honor, lacks foundation. There is no evidence to suggest that anything so cloak and dagger is going on here, at least as far as we know right now. But it is still possible that Mizobe receiving training and even a patent credit from Nintendo only to turn around and make Palworld for Sony is a violation of the social contract we discussed that is so prevalent in Japanese business. As such, while Mizobe's Nintendo patent isn't likely to be the primary consideration for this lawsuit, it is a possible aggravating secondary consideration. At least this seems to be the case given what we know so far. What about the other obvious consideration, which is that Nintendo really does want to protect whatever patent it's alleging has been infringed? I mean, Nintendo has that third-person Pokeball catching patent in Japan, right? And it's filing patents here in the US as well, isn't it? Well, maybe it just wants to protect its mechanics from Palworld. What if like a million new games come out with this third-person catching shtick that's supposed to be the defining mechanic of modern Pokémon games? Surely then it's a good idea to pluck the weed before it has a chance to spread. All of this is possibly true, but if Palworld was just Palworld and Pocket Pair was just Pocket Pair, I suspect that Nintendo wouldn't be willing to put its patents on the line and fight a 6 to 10 year, multi-million-dollar lawsuit. The problem with Pocket Pair is that it isn't content to be an indie dev. It sees dollar signs, and joining up with Sony, that is big enough to be a massive, genuine threat, worthy of a patent suit and all the labor and risk and cost such a suit entails. Even in Japan, where the standards, as you recall, are generally stricter. There are other minor aggravating factors that I haven't covered, I'm sure. By all means, leave your theories in the comments, and I'll see if I can't offer some clarity. But I do think that at present, all roads point to a counter-volley against Sony, and that Nintendo's patent suit against Palworld makes the most sense in that context. There are a ton of monster collecting games. Pokémon itself took inspiration from Dragon Quest and maybe Lufia 2 as well. There's Digimon and Yokai Watch and Temtem and Monster Rancher and Nexomon and Monster Sanctuary and Cassette Beasts. The problem isn't that Palworld has collectible monsters. It's not that Palworld shines a spotlight on Pokémon's contradictions with its guns and slavery either. I mean, Digimon does that too, kind of. So does every other Pokémon, like everyone tries to point at the weird cognitive dissonance present in Pokémon. Digimon, though, is owned by Bandai Namco, a company that has a good relationship with Nintendo and is more a partner and less a competitor. Bamco is the head developer for Smash 4 and Smash Ultimate. The two companies are friends. But Sony and Nintendo, they are decidedly not friends. Not after Nintendo reneged on their social contract and escaped the Sony trap. Not after Sony made a desperate power play to grab Palworld and weaken Nintendo's position. It's one thing to have a one-off smash hit indie game that maybe spawns a sequel or two before dying. It's another situation entirely to have a Sony-cultivated crown jewel of a franchise, with merchandise and an anime and a cinematic universe and mobile game spin-offs and a long-term plan for sequels, all built atop a foundation of your star franchise's narrative contradictions. At best, it hurts your brand. It makes your brand look less wholesome. At worst, there's the potential for consumer confusion or even trademark dilution. This Tansy here looks exactly like a Grookey with a gun. And if Palworld becomes a global hit anime for adults, will a parent buy a Grookey plush for her kid if she sees Grookey but thinks of Palworld's assault rifle-wielding Tansy? There's a lot of potential damage to Nintendo on the table here. Damage that Sony would be thrilled to see, and even more thrilled to capitalize on. Sony's made its desperate play, and Nintendo in response has pulled out the big guns in hopes of ending this play before it gets out of control. It's mutually assured destruction, it's a stare down, and neither side looks like it's ready to blink first. I've been your host, Mooney. Moon Channel donates 10% of its income to charity, so thank you for being patient with this week's sponsor, Zen Market. Special thanks also to Moon Channel artists Yu-Fong and Adlerita Shine for the thumbnails and art. To Parabeetle X, Silva Gunner, and the fine folks at Timmy Turner's Granddad for the lovely music. And last but not least, thank you to Moon Channel's incredible patrons, without whom none of this would be possible. And of course, thank you for tuning in to Moon Channel. And now it's time for Silly Songs with Mooney, the part of the show where Mooney comes out and sings a silly song. With apologies to Richard M. Sherman and Robert B. Sherman, I actually unironically love the original song very much.